Hey, what's up everyone? Today I want to share with you how I made this wooden chest inspired by the Witcher series. There was some really challenging aspects to this build, like doing the mortise and tenon and dovetail joinery, making this curved lid, and of course just all the engravings. So stick around, I'm going to show you the whole process, explain how I did it. My name's Rob, this is Further Fabrication, let's get into it.
Let's start with a bit of context. The Witcher series is set in a medieval fantasy world with the usual array of humans, elves, dwarves, magic and monsters. Witchers are professional monster hunters who travel from village to village to solve monster related issues for money. I'll put some links below if you're not familiar and you want to know more, but basically this chest would be used to hold alchemy tools and potions and whatnot. So the timber I'm using for this build was rescued from the landfill, and I believe it's a New Zealand native species called rimu. I'm trimming up these boards to get them nice and square and flat, as they're going to become the main carcass of the chest. To lay out the dovetails, I thought I'd try a new method, which is to place masking tape down over the join areas so that when I score my lines, I can peel away the tape and have a very clear, precise edge to work from. In my experience, the clearer your layout lines, the better your joinery is going to be, so this really helps, especially in situations where you're working in a dimly lit shed. While I could have cut these by hand, I'm a big believer in choosing your battles. Cutting the tails with a table saw is straightforward and saves a lot of time, and it's fairly idiot proof on a cheap wobbly table saw like this, as any accuracy errors you make here can just be accommodated for when you mark out the pins. I couldn't think of a good powered way to cut the pins, so I figured by the time I made a jig, I could have just cut them out by hand anyway. So here I am, doing it the old-fashioned way. I'd like to pretend that these were a perfect fit straight away, but there was some back and forthing with the chisel to get the fit right. For the mortise and tenons, the process was very similar. I used the position of the dovetails to mark where the tenons would be, but before I cut them out, I added a strip of tape over my miter sled to get a new clean curve to help me eyeball the tenon cuts. I made my first cuts just off to the side of my line, and then I'd nibble my way up to it. After marking out the mortises, I drilled out the bulk of the waste and then squared up the corners with a bit of chiseling. Then I could do a quick dry fit.
Alright, so that's hopefully the bulk of the hand-cut joinery stuff dealt with. What I want to do next is move on to sorting out the lid and the shape of that and how that works and all that stuff.
So yeah, everything so far has been pretty by the book. It's kind of now where things start to get a touch more complicated. I messed around on the computer to create a nice arc for the top of the lid, and I didn't know this then, but this is the moment I really stitched myself up. I'll show you why in just a sec when we get to it. I used double-sided tape to temporarily join the two side pieces together so they'd stay in place and be identical as I cut out the curve and separated the lid pieces. I then cut strips from an offcut piece so that they could be the slats for the curved lid. Now, this was the problem. The arc I'd made for the lid was actually a non-uniform curve, which is to say the curvature angle changes as you move across it, as opposed to a uniform curve where the angles stay the same. Think of an ellipse versus circle. I'd chosen a non-uniform curve shape because I thought it looked cooler, which it does. However, fitting the slats so their angles match the radius became quite the ordeal. My original plan was just to cut the angles in with a table saw, but we're talking a changing difference in angles of less than half a degree between slats in some cases, and as it turns out, I just couldn't get that kind of accuracy. So what I settled for instead was just to shape them by hand. It was slow, but it worked. Did I mention things get more complicated? Well, things get more complicated. I wanted to do some engravings all over the chest to really make this thing something special that tied in with its fantasy inspiration. Unfortunately, the closest thing I'm going to get to magical engravings is using a laser cutter. So to engrave the top of the curved lid, all the pieces would need to be laid flat inside the laser cutter and then fitted back on after engraving. So I created this jig to temporarily hold the slats down so I could do their final shaping, but also be able to pull them off in position so that I could lay them flat inside the bed of the laser. With all the parts prepped, it was time to fire up the laser cutter. To line up the pieces, I used a scrap bit of plywood which I engraved a rectangle onto, so that then when I lined up each of the parts with the edges of the rectangle, I'd know everything would be aligned, provided I didn't bump anything. I spent quite a while designing the artwork for the engravings. I wanted it to fit with the Witcher lore but not be too obvious at a casual glance. I drew a lot of inspiration from the idea of alchemy and early astronomy diagrams, as well as elements from the Witcher video games. I'll put a link below if you'd like a copy of the artwork. It kinda seems a shame for it to only be used once. After I'd engraved the main pieces of the chest, I could finally glue up all the joinery. For attaching the panels, I wanted to do more of an old school look, so I'm using square cut tacks. They have this really interesting shape, they have this extreme taper to them, so you have to be careful you place them in the correct orientation. You want the thin edge to be running in the direction of the wood grain, otherwise there's a good chance they'll split your timber. I pre-drilled the pilot holes just a touch smaller than the tack before gluing them in and hammering them down. To further avoid splitting, and because of the tack's extreme taper, I also drilled pilot holes in the substrate piece, but with the size smaller drill bit. With the chest carcass glued up, I could tackle the lid slats again. I'd left them up until now so that I could get the final dimensions off it for sizing the lid engraving. I pulled the slats off the jig I made earlier, numbering them so that I could keep their orientation, and now I can stick them down flat to be laser engraved, which I would show you right now. Except I lost the footage of that happening, so you just have to believe me. With the slats back from imaginary laser engraving, I could, at last, attach them as one piece. I had to be careful of glue squeeze out because I couldn't really come back and sand it out because the engraving's only about 1 millimeter or so deep, which is also why I had all that fuss earlier with smoothing it all out on the jig before engraving. Because this chest already weighs a ton, I'm making the drawers from pine. I measured the pieces in place before marking out and cutting the joinery for the drawer sides. I used this kind of locking dado joint. I also cut a recess for the bottom panel. The glue up was super easy, just connected the four corners, dropped in the bottom panel before throwing some clamps on it. I'm using a black tint to stain the pine so that it fits with the colour palette of the rest of the chest. To tie it in a little nicer, and because my drawer sides were a little low, I added some rimu trim to the top edge. I could then attach the face panel. I used playing cards as shims to make sure I had an even gap, and then used my old faithful double-sided tape to get the position bang on before screwing it down. Oh, we're so close to getting this done. I just need to trim up a few final spots that I'd left long. This was a little nerve-wracking, but I felt like it was the best way. You might have noticed I left all my dovetail pins and tenons long, rather than trimming them flush. because I kind of like the extra dimension it gives. It makes them a bit more of a feature. After a quick cleanup, it's time to apply the finish. I was going to use the last of my Danish oil to do this, but it looks like the jelly you used to get at the all-you-can-eat dessert bar back when Pizza Hut was an actual restaurant. So I'm going to use Wipe On Poly instead, which is going to be my new go-to because it doesn't take an eternity to dry like Danish oil does. So when I did the artwork for the engravings, I created little points where they would match up to the location of the hardware. I did the artwork and the engraving before I had the handles, so they're not completely perfect, but they're pretty close. I would really love to one day be able to forge my own handles and hinges and things. I think that would have been awesome, but for now I'll just have to settle with the store-bought variety. The hinge installation was pretty straightforward. The curved lid just made it a little tricky to clamp steady while I was clearing it with the chisel. To mark the hinge locations on the other side, I covered the bottoms with masking tape and then superglued them together. By lifting the lid away, I was able to mark nice knife lines where the bottom slot needed to be. I know, it's bothering me too. Silver screws and a dark metal hinge. Ugh. Don't worry, after I get them fit, I'll pull them back out and spray paint them black. I made the lid stays from a couple of strips of leather. The lid's quite heavy, so I did them on both sides. I eyeballed the position and then cut 2 strips the same length. Using double-sided tape, I set them in position before nailing them down with a couple of shortened tacks. And with that final nail, we are done.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this build, let me know in the comments or hit that like button. I really want to share more of the things I make with you, and if you want to see them, maybe consider subscribing. Alright, I gotta go. I'll see you next time.